Welcome to another episode of Well Dwellers Podcast. I'm Eric Freiberger, and I'm coming to you from Treaty 7 lands, Calgary, Alberta. It is blistery cold here today, but I'm excited to share with you a warm and heart-filled conversation I had with someone I can call my friend now, John Van Sloten. We met a few weeks ago, and very quickly I picked up on a very incredible gift he has of speaking humbly and with a calming voice. And yet I found John's stories about his son, Edward, and himself to be powerfully inspiring and full of wisdom. His son Edward's joy and delight in life no doubt comes from his relationship with his earthly father, but it also reveals a deeply profound faith and relationship that he finds within his heavenly Father. Together, John and I talk about his writings, experiences within the community, and particularly in the ways people with disabilities find meaning and purpose in work and vocational callings. There is a lot of good stuff here in the course of the hour that our conversation goes. I hope that you might listen to this episode and find it connecting with much of your own story and life within community and calling. And I also hope you get to listen to it over and over, because as I listen to it several times over, I keep finding new and more nuggets of wisdom just embedded within our dialogue. Now, another really exciting thing I wanted to tell you about was of the upcoming Good News event, New Body, New Church, that The Well is putting together along with my partners at Deeper Communion and with Ambrose University. We are getting to try to explore the theme of reigniting a prophetic imagination and being good news for and as disabled people today. So on April 12th, from 2 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon, we are having two presenters, one of which is going to be John Van Sloten's and his son Edward's talk as they share as one of our presentations. You'll have a chance to also dialogue with them in a Q&A on our panel, as well as I'm sure afterwards. So, and then our other presenter will be Lisa Ways, who you will hear in a couple weeks, also here on the podcast. So I'm excited for you to perhaps get the chance to sign up to that. You'll see it again at the end of our conversation in the video closing out, and there'll be a QR code you can follow to both register to attend in person or register to attend online. So please do sign up, and I hope you can join us then. There will be resources to John's blog and website in the show notes for this episode. But with that, let's get to John's and my conversation. I am excited to hear your thoughts. Please do share this with others you think will find this inspiring. And please sign up to the atthebottomofthewell.com's newsletter, where you'll receive future publications, both from the podcast and from my writing. Until next time, enjoy John Van Sloten. Hey, John, it is great to have you here on the Well Dwellers podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation with you for a while. I know that from what I've seen online, that you are considered a community theologian and pastor. I know you are a father and a husband, and that you write on a blog regularly. You write for Calgary Herald, and you've written 3 books: The Day Metallica Came to Church, which might come into our conversation because I have several family members who would be very disappointed if I didn't say anything about that.
What was that about?
Yeah, exactly. You've written recently God Speaks Science, and as well as the particular subject that I thought we might get into, Every Job a Parable, of course, on Well Dwellers, we talk a lot about disability, dignity, and hope. So I'm kind of hoping that our conversation is shaped by those themes in the idea of career and work and calling in the disabled community. So I'm very intrigued by some of the thoughts you might have towards that subject. So welcome.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, well, I kind of talked a bit about your activities. Maybe you'd like to tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and something that maybe nobody knows.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole community theologian thing, I just made that up, right? I have pastored churches for the last 8 years, and just this past year made a decision to try to do what I do, but outside of the confines of a church building. So it's a church without walls kind of thing where you do a lot of the pastoral work and sort of spiritual conversations and stuff more in the public sphere. So it's an experiment, and I have no idea what a community theologian is other than that sketched out description. Something about myself that people don't know about. It's hard for me not to bring up that I cycled across Canada in 2005.
Wow.
And, yeah, I'm primarily a non-athletic person, so to have accomplished anything of that magnitude was a pretty cool thing. Yeah, I am. What people don't know right now is I am in the middle of a journey that has me wondering about everything. What is church, and what is my calling, and what am I to do for this next chapter of ministry in my life? And over this past year of experimenting with this community theologian role, realizing I still increasingly have no idea. I'm putting down all of the tools that I was taught at seminary and worked successfully in ministry for so long, and trying to discern what the new things are that I need to pick up. So, yeah, I don't know if that makes me a good candidate for answering your questions or responding, but it's a very wandering place for me right now.
Some of the best pastors in our history, I think, were wanderers. So I think that's a great way to describe yourself. Community theologian. I think that's a beautiful way to discern God at work in the community too. So as we mentioned, I mentioned to you earlier, I've been in house church movement activities for over a decade, and I think that, as we begin to ask ourselves about the church, we find it beyond the walls. It's not centered within a building, and I don't think Jesus intended that either. So wow,
I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about stepping in this direction.
Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't say I'm a choir, but I definitely have a lot of experiences of church beyond the walls. So I actually was intrigued by your recent blog post that we will hopefully maybe touch on later, if that's okay.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Talking about the disability community and what a lot of my listeners are listening for. The past few weeks as well, we've been exploring some of this conversation of what does disability mean? So maybe if you could describe in your own words your connection to disability, how you find relationship with it, and where its meaning might be found in your life.
Primary means is via the connection to my third born son, who is 32 years old and was born with Down syndrome. Over the years, as soon as your son's born with a disability, you stop comparing to everyone else. But then within a year or so, you start comparing to all the other kids with Down syndrome and how he's doing. And Edward, my son, is is a wonderfully natured, fairly low functioning, mostly nonverbal young man with Down syndrome who volunteers in a work and leisure program here in Calgary at a program called Chrysalis. And so my primary engagement with the topic of disability, and I guess the theology of disability, has been within the family. But I've also 10 years ago, I had to get a psych exam for an official ordination, and psychologist, we ended up talking about some stuff, and he said, what you're describing about what you've struggled with your whole life is classic dyslexia, right? I'm going, you're kidding. So at 44, I knew the symptoms my whole life, but at 44, I realized that reading sentences backwards and jumping to the ends of paragraphs and starting on the opposite page and not is a mix of dyslexia and probably some ADHD. So it, in a way, has become a little personal. Those two forms of engagement or points of engagement, I don't equate. The Down syndrome thing with Edward has been sort of the primary vehicle for thinking about and living into what disability is like in our world today. Mm-hmm. But this personal thing has made it more personal. And I find sometimes I'm thinking about my stuff. Another thing is anxiety and panic attacks, which started a few years ago for me. And how my weaknesses and limitations in a couple of spheres converse with his and vice versa. And so, yeah, I'm in it. Who of us in our world is not without a limitation or a weakness or a need or a less capacity in a particular sphere of their life. Not to make the argument that everyone struggles with a disability, but it's the answer to your question is it's partly what I'm starting to know about myself and a lot of what my son has taught and is teaching me.
Yeah, I'm actually been growing a bit in the idea of disability being not only something we identify within ourselves, but it's something that also interlaces and links us with others. Things like anxiety is connected not just to my state of emotion, but the state of emotions around me, or what's happening within my body, or with other people as well. So that when we identify, yes, I have a disability with certain struggles, they're not just my disabilities; they're a shared disability and community too. So, I can appreciate what you're drawing there, and that's rich. Yeah. Of course, we're drawing also a conversation around the idea of career and work activities. And so when you think of that image of God, now I'm just sort of thinking too, the image of God is also interlaced, is it not? We are the body of Christ. We are the body of God in connection. So how do we see or how would you articulate and describe how the image of God plays out in the work life of those with disabilities, particularly, but even in general? Where does the image of God begin to be shown in a person's vocation?
Yeah. My son Edward is involved with Chrysalis, and he has a couple of vocational placements, and they're quite similar. He goes to Providence Care Center, and he goes to the Wing Key Senior Center downtown, and he volunteers in the laundry and is a towel folder. A towel folder extraordinaire. He's blazing fast, and he's so proud of his work, and finds. I learned by surprise. We were going swimming one day at a YMCA where he was coincidentally volunteering, and instead of heading to the change room, he went running to the laundry and navigated a labyrinth of always, because he had to show his dad how good he was at this work. So yeah, fairly basic work, but to him, deeply meaningful work, by which, and I'm thinking of how he images God in that place, through his dexterity, through touch, through taking a messy pile of towels out of a dryer and stewarding that little part of creation to bring it into a better order, so that it can be used for the greater good in the community that he's serving. And then believing sort of theologically that that's a small part of what he's doing there, also knowing that even as I was filled with delight when he was showing off his folding skills to me, that God also deeply delights in Edward working. And this is any work. God delights in Edward's work fully, like his father, me, does. And God delights in my work, and your work, and all of our work as fully. Not really based on, the acuity that we bring to our task, or the the size of the impact in the world, or the amount of goodness it brings to the common good. But I think mostly because we're doing something we were made to do and are capable of doing, and finding meaning in the doing. And God delights in that. Delights in that equally. I think God delights in the work of a Nobel laureate as much as he does my son, Edward, folding towels. And I think the difference between the Nobel laureate's work and my son's work before a perfect and infant God is infinitesimal. And God doesn't have a bias against Nobel laureates. I think he delights in their work as much as he does Edward's. So yeah, I do that kind of theological work or thinking about his work. And yeah, maybe, I'm writing a book right now on the parable of his life and my life, Edward's life and mine. And my experience is, as a dad with a kid with Down syndrome, who's also a theologian, who's into exegeting where God's at work in the world and the image-bearing nature of people. I'm not a disability expert. I haven't been speaking or living into the world of advocacy in a significant way, other than sort of personally for my son. So I'm reticent to speak too much about how I see it, because it's only through a very limited lens, in terms of my experience. But yeah, that's sort of what I do with everybody, a CEO downtown, or my son at his work folding towels. So I don't know if that it answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you're talking a lot about God delighting in our work, and I think that's kind of a major principal point of yours, and I can see that. I think one of the things that, as a person with a disability, as a incomplete quadriplegic from spinal cord injury, I've had a number of different jobs throughout my life. I'm 46 years old, so have a bit of experience and background, vocational work as well as volunteer work and such. And I think one of the things that kind of, I don't know if you're seeing it, but your description of Edward's excitement over showing you the work that he does and expressing the delight he has in it is also a reflection of God's delight in his work. You know, I think back to my own experiences of work life and such. And, so often it was almost a roller coaster ride at times. This is full confession mode here.
I'm a pastor. I mean, we can mute this section if you need to really get open.
But I live my life as an open book. I don't mind it. But there are moments when I would be bogged down and hit by the weight of what the world perceives as being something to delight in, something that is valuable or considered profitable or enjoyable type thing, work, and feel weighted down by it as this is really not delightful work, if you want to put it that way. And then there were other times where, and it was obvious that I could feel God working inside of me, where I took great delight in some of those simple work experiences, aside from sometimes what I felt was an injustice to the disabled world. Certain biases and prejudices, which we can get into later, the ableism of our society. But I could feel at times this overwhelming sense of delight and excitement about doing some of these wonderful, simple work that impacts other people's lives. So maybe the question that I'm sort of pondering as you were describing Edward's delight and excitement is how do I, as a disabled man, or how does someone with a disability try to keep a focus or look for that delight in whatever vocation and work they have, and not to be distracted or bogged down by the weight of a world's expectations?
Yeah. And this is where my caveat on, not having written extensively or thought about or done vocations through the lens of a person with a disability leaves me feeling like I'm getting on increasingly thin ice to the sound of cracking. But I have, when I wrote Every Job a Parable, I found that some of the truest, most beautiful, simple reflections and echoes and things that are vocational ways that rhymed with the nature and way of God, that imaged God, were in jobs like cleaners. Cleaners are made in the image of a God who takes away the trash to make room for the new. I mean, the gospel, with every room cleaned, and I'm not trying to say that that's not dirty work or people aren't treated well in that. But I mean, the very act of cleaning, when we clean our homes, when we clean our lives, our bodies, is reflective of the essence of the Christian gospel. And then everywhere I looked at different jobs, electricians bring an energizing power to life that vivifies inanimate things, be they light bulbs or machines or radios or televisions. In their mediating, connecting work, there is a Christ-likeness to wiring things up and flipping the switch. That is akin to creation. God created the heavens and the earth and then made the sun and created on and off. And for the electrician and for the cleaner and for the Walmart greeter and for the lady, 78-year-old woman who delivered flyers in our neighborhood, all these connections, even there where they thought, yeah, not here, to your point on our society elevates certain things and it ignores or denigrates others. For me, it was just a real leveling of the playing field. In fact, the last and the least and the seemingly culturally defined most significant things seem to most eloquently reflect you, Jesus, God, in terms of your heart for service and humility and helping others find their way and not self-aggrandizing and working behind the scenes, etc., etc. So that doesn't solve the problem, I guess, to your question of how do you how can people find more dignity there? But I think there is a theological, a more broad and imaginative theological take on the work of any of your listeners. Ordinary work, small work, that in the imaging reflects God in a compelling way. And in knowing that, this is where I get a bit mystical. So maybe there's a knowing of God as the cleaning plays out, right? There's an experience of God's humility, Christ in the Gospels, who would wash feet as I clean my toilets at home. And a knowing that evokes a sense of presence that gets me close to the delight that God feels, not just for me as a worker, us as workers, but for us. And that kind of math. So, yeah, you probably have people who listen to this who've got, 100 different perspectives on vocation or doing all kinds of different work where the question could be applied. And my first thought is, send them all in, and we'll have a conversation, and then we'll do a little theological exercise on it and see what that particular job, that small, ordinary job, says about smallness and the ordinariness and the taking care of every detail God.
Yeah. Yeah. You, in another blog post, you talked about Edward being seen. And I think that that's something that is also an act of God bringing meaning and purpose to work, as God enters that area no matter what the world weights it as or values it as, and puts a knowing, a seeing of that person and the work that they do into a kingdom value. So, I hear all sorts of parallels to gospel stories of Jesus counted himself as nothing, the whole act of kenosis, of emptying himself to enter the world and become a servant to all. I hear, the idea of, how he would lift up. And I think that's kind of where I'm sort of wondering how we find a parallel balance. And I realize I might be pushing you out on a limb here. I'm just curious about your experiences. But part of me, when I think of my giftings within the Spirit, it's the prophetic element. The idea that Jesus always brought himself into the world, but he also elevated the world. He redeemed it. He lifted it up so that when it was the paralytic, he restored him into the community by saying, your sins are forgiven. He elevated him before he ever told him to get up and walk. The blind man was given the sense of glory in John 9, so that you will see the glory of God within him, even before he healed his sight. There was always this sense of activism as well. This past week, Ty and I were on a bit of a conversation of how, we hear all the time about how the church is in a slow movement to respond to this. We want to listen to the disabled and see them. But we also, are wondering, when do we get to the part where we begin to lift up the disabled community? When we lift up the people in their careers, we see them, but we also elevate them and recognize or even speak out against the ableism that's in the world, holding them down from true calling.
Yeah, I hear all of that. And in my year of wondering and wandering, at this point in that year, 12 months in, am wondering if I've had just a whole series of interesting events that have all been happening in this sphere of the theology of disability and the life of my son, and I'm writing a book, and I gave a talk at Edward's program, and you reached out and you talked about that other thing, and I'm going, is that something I can help with? So yeah, part of my response is to want to be part of that solution. When I This year I'm in has been so humbling. Like, stop performing, John. Stop with the pressure of having to have metrics that your supporters can see that their investment is well invested. Stop. Like, put it all down. And I'm egocentric enough to think I was good at all those things, and I could write books and preach sermons and make it happen and control everything. Just had it all working for me. So to just by the work of the Spirit be called to put more and more and more and become less and less and less and less. I feel like I'm closer now, and maybe I'm only 10% of the way there, to being able to really see others, to see my son, and others. They're happening in a kind of intermingled way over these last few months, so that they can see that they're seen and experience the being seen moment and the delight of that. But so that I can then know, okay, you're seen. That's great. You're valued. You're loved, delighted in. But now what, right? I feel like I'd only be able to begin to answer the question. I feel like I'm only in a place now where I'm able to begin to answer the question because I'm seeing for the first time. I'm seeing for the first time over the past year who my 32-year-old son is. And I'm seeing the lifeguard at the pool differently than I've ever seen them over 20 years ago going to the pool. I'm seeing it's all being changed as I become more and more lost in the best sense and have no idea where I'm going and just yearning daily for a sense of the Spirit's movements and what God is doing in the world. I feel like if you asked me the question in 3 years, if this becomes a sphere that I end up walking into for this next chapter, I'd have a really good answer because, until you're incarnate in the world, right? And the world of those who struggle with limitation and disability, and special awarenesses and special wiring in unique ways, neuro diversely being, you can't. I'm just like everyone else who doesn't see it, right? Doesn't know why they have to put a bloody ramp in front of that building or make an accommodation here or there. I'm not that person now. I mean, I have learned a bit over the 32 years, but yet. And I in repeating a bit of what I said earlier, deep down, I think, and this is what I hope the book can be, as people see the strength and dignity, power of Edward, a person with severe cognitive disabilities, 2 or 3 years old, maybe in terms of language, not even, and then maybe 4 or 5 years old in terms of receptive language. Like, he's a kid. He plays with Toy Story stuff. Still, he's on the world's metrics for a 32-year-old man. He's behind the 8 ball. But if they saw what I'm beginning to see, then reading a book maybe even would change a perspective in a way that culture as a whole would then begin to shift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure on one book, and one life and one story. But like there is such he knows himself in a way that I am envious of. He is good with who he is in a way that I hope to one day find that sort of sense of self.
Mm.
He can receive from others in the body of the church and the body of the community that is Calgary in ways that I can only dream of receiving from others. He assumes good in other people so graciously and wholly in his naivete in that regard. Like, there are things there in him, and this is him, not everybody with a disability, everyone different, but they're, I think, by sort of letting somebody sent me a note this morning, said she's on the board for what I'm doing right now, and she said, I you're letting us into something we'd never see in terms of who this young disabled man is. And whenever people read the stories that I'm posting on my blog, or hopefully the book or chapters of the book as I put them out to the world now, they're surprised and they cry and they see something and
Mm.
and I don't know if that makes buildings more accessible. I don't know how that gets from, but it's one heart at a time kind of thing. And where Edward excels, I mean, honestly, I saw a news program, or was it 60 Minutes, I think, on people on the autism spectrum who are working for intelligence agencies reviewing spy satellite photographs because of their pattern recognition, their unique pattern recognition capacities, which, like, they're 98% accurate in terms of these workers being able to do that particular job. And people with dyslexia, you read in evolutionary psychology, new books coming out, where they think evolutionarily really good at reading the land and knowing where the water sources were and remembering how everything fit together in terms of the larger landscape. And, I think about my processing and dealing with dyslexia and how it taught me to read the room in schools when I couldn't read, and how reading the room helped get me to the place of doing what I do vocationally, which is God in the Bible, and then God in the world here and God in the world there. And all I'm doing is reading the room. And thank God for dyslexic orientations that uniquely wire me for that kind of work. Like, yeah, I just imagine all of the excellences of a lot of what is perceived as need might make a difference. Is that utopian? How do you hear that? You go, yeah, but.
When I'm listening to your descriptions here, I'm seeing a significant sense that by being rooted, by allowing for time, as you said earlier, 3 years, right? Or even longer. John Perkins says you're not really truly rooted in a community unless you've been there for 10 years. People with disabilities, in my own life and the experiences that I've had, we can't put the measurements of the world on them and the way they see the world, because when we spend time with them long enough, and when I think of my time in the world and the way I see it, we begin to realize that it's far more in depth and revealing than what the world perceived it as. So, I hope it's okay to say this. When you describe Edward within the 3 to 4, I think you said 3 to 4 year old,
Receptive language, yeah.
Perceptive language. That's just what the world is perceiving. But if we look through Edward's eyes, what he sees might be far more wise and revealing to us than anything we could have seen before. I think of the experience I had when I was in hospital after my spinal cord injury. There was a gentleman there who had a pretty significant stroke, and all he could do was sit in a cardiac chair, and drool and cry and scream. And I would come up from physiotherapy or whatever, and he'd be sitting in the hallway. People were ignoring him. He'd be screaming, and visibly upset. But I would sit and I'd just talk with him about the day. And, in true confession, it was purely out of selfish motive. When I did that, he would quieten down
Yeah.
because I spent time with him and I was rooted in that space with him. And I listened, even from my own perception of value. But it would be years later that I would be wheeling down the street, and I see him wheeling towards me, with one leg on the ground, pulling himself along,
Hmm.
and we spoke to one another. And he didn't remember me, but he talked about living in the area and the weather. He was verbal at this time. And that moment just struck me that if we are not willing to be rooted and spend time with someone, um, especially the disabled community, how can we truly have any right or ability to measure the value of what they see? It's just not possible. So I think you point to something very valuable there, that if we want to see the significance of a person's work, it's not by simply putting our own value or perception of ourselves on them, but rather, as Jesus did, engage, be rooted and involved in the life um, of that person with a disability,
Yeah.
and let that shape the way we lift them up in the workforce, in the
Yeah.
career, in the community. So,
Yeah. 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 And what I'm discovering in my little corner of that conversation is way more there than you ever thought. You were the person who, when he was born, had all those stereotypes and limitations of perceptual limitations in terms of what a person with Down syndrome was. I had negative perception. I think it was bad. A good transformation over the last 30 years since then. But now seeing things like language, I'm just starting. We're in the middle of a chapter on communication and the challenges of limited communication. But just in writing about it and watching the advantages of limited communication, Edward's limited communication is much more universal than mine. I mean, he could go and hang with someone in Spain with Down syndrome, and I'm sure they'd have a very good day together, right? Without having, the verbal language. He's amazing at picking up nonverbal signals. He can feel the room, and I'm only imagining, how much he really knows what's going on, even though we never hear it from him. And what thoughts he's processing, whether they're verbally constructed or emotionally constructed. Like he could be like have an eloquence on the emotional scale that is I can't even imagine. And then, I was writing about it and going, yeah, and then I'm looking up the stats and Googling, and, how much of communication do they say is nonverbal, and anywhere from 70 to 80% of any conversation with anyone is nonverbal cues. What's really being said is said 80% of it. And I'm going, okay, he is a more eloquent communicator than I am now, because he can read people and find a way to communicate. Now, that's a real simplification of just a little observation, but yeah, I now relate to him differently. I'm not going to argue with my wife in the front seat of the car when he's in the back, assuming he's not understanding our conversation, because he's picking up, like any child, with all the vibes, right? And he's got other languages by which he is engaging the world that he's far more eloquent in, arguably, than I am, than we are. It's my own son, though. Okay, this is like, and talk about confessions, right? Shouldn't I have figured this out when he was 3? And shouldn't I have? And yet, back to that earlier point, I think God's plan is to make me small enough, in the best sense, to be able to see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you get the world to do that?
Yeah. That's funny. My wife and I were talking the other day about the conversation I had with Cynthia Tam a few weeks ago, and how she described how perhaps God always meant for us to always be wrestling with this idea of disability and what it is and how we relate to it. And it's a growth experience. And so I think that, like with any growing creation, it grows at different paces. It has different seasons. There's different timing for all things. Well, we're getting into your God speaks science, right?
Mm.
So, the idea of, why didn't I figure this out before? That's maybe I could be wrong. Maybe that's not the question to ask. The question is how do I nurture this and make it grow more?
Yeah. Yeah.
As I grow more in the relationship of disability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of that.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a bit about hope as well before we close our conversation. But you mentioned earlier about being a mystic in the stream of vocational mysticism. How do we as disabled people be vocationally mystics?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, a worldview that believes that God is at work through us in image-bearing ways. God is caring for the common good of our city through the work that we do. So the work products of whatever our work is, our cleaning, our accounting, our whatever, got something to do with all of that. God is the one who made all of the functions in us, imagined our manual dexterity and our vision and our creativity and our gift with pattern recognition, our proclivity with color and shape, and our strong back to do that manual labor, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if that God is involved in all of those things, if you have a worldview that has room for all of that, then I guess it's listen. Listen to. Like, I have moments where I'll be doing something physically that Edward can't do with his low muscle tone, and I'll just. It may not be vocationally, like it's not my job to do the physical thing, but just in the act of bending and my knees doing what my knees are doing, and the biomechanical miracle that's happening structurally as I'm able to maintain balance and lift something. Like, the moment is mystically, like, I'm just filled with gratitude and awe and worship at the God who conceived of a human body that could do those things. So yeah, I think the worldview is part of it, but I think for me, it's just a gift of a God whose spirit just kind of lets me and can let all of us kind of see, were we to ask for it. Give me eyes to see and ears to hear what's really going on when I do my job. Maybe that kind of a prayer, and then an attentiveness throughout the day to wait for maybe that kind of moment, right? Where your ability to do math well, or to do whatever you do well happens, and then counting on the Spirit of God to maybe connect it to an attribute of God that as a Christian, the Bible points to, or a story about the farmer, or the jewel merchant, or the one who owned land,
Hmm.
the craftsman, the woodworker, and then let those two texts, you doing your thing and sort of a facet of the nature of God or a story from the scriptures, talk to each other. Yeah, hold them close to each other, let them co-illumine one another. That's a big thing for me, this idea of co-illumination, that God's revelation in the scriptures has always been written in a way that it's meant to be read in concert with God's revelation in creation. In this particular case, in our bodies working, and that that scripture comes more alive when God is moving in here and now ways like that in creation, and creation comes more alive when I read it through the lens of scripture, and they talk to each other.
Yeah. And I wonder too if, the creative artistic imagination is also part of that. You were describing some of the characters in scripture, and I was thinking of other characters in the imaginative sense. We have the friends around the paralytic. You ever wonder what that paralytic did besides beg on the side of the road? Maybe
Yeah.
he had some other vocational activity or work on the docks with fishermen.
Yeah.
Something in the market. I don't know. One of the things that I found really intriguing, despite what anyone might think of the show, The Chosen. One
You're
of the
watching
things that
for a facial expression from me, and you just got a blank look. I haven't watched
okay.
it, so
Okay. To be honest, I'm not a big fan, so I don't continue watching it. But I did watch for a bit with the first season with my wife, and one of the things that stood out to me was that the character of Matthew, the tax collector, was portrayed as potentially, and they don't call it out, but maybe a bit on the spectrum, in the autistic spectrum, because he was good with numbers, right?
yeah.
And
Awesome.
the Romans loved him for this, right? Of course, he's a great tax collector. And of course, Jesus recognizes this too, right? Sees this gifting of an autistic gift, and blessing, and redeems it, brings it into the kingdom and the values of the kingdom, and empowers it. So, we allow that creative, artistic imagination to shape some of those biblical connections too, maybe.
Yeah,
As we,
I was just talking to my wife a couple days ago about a thought struck me. I mean, how long have people with Down syndrome been around, right? And a quick Google search, and skeletons from 2,600 years ago, and as far as we know, always sort of part of the population, right? At historically 1 out of 700 births.
hmm,
So then I started doing some Jesus math on that, right? And I surely at that ratio, Christ met someone, like, physically was close to someone with Down syndrome. And if it was a person with Down syndrome, for all we know, they weren't intimidated by the wisdom of the rabbi. They went right up for a hug, right? And
hmm,
and this mutual embrace. And even, yeah, that might work its way into some thinking in the book, right? But Matthew, that's great. Yeah, maybe I ought to watch the show because it does, right? Make it real people, right? Not just these saint-like, limited to how we understand them through the Gospels people, but real people doing real things.
Yeah. Yeah. We could go on with lots more here, but I do want to touch on a few other things before we close off. And I'm wondering where to go. I think the first thing I might like to do is share a quote from your latest blog post that really piqued my interest, and poke your thoughts on it. Exploring a church without walls. You said, "This makes me wonder if my serendipitous experiences of the past year are foretastes. If this is where God is taking things, could a church without walls simply be the spiritual reenchantment of all life?" And I think I love the expression there. The question is good. I think a lot of Christians, I think a lot of non-Christians should be maybe asking that question, and wrestling with it. What is the church if it's not the building with four walls around it? Um, can you take us a little further into that? What are you meaning by that? And how are you seeing church manifest without walls?
Hmm. I'm the yeah. I'm the chapel and local pastor of the Killarney Public Pool here in Calgary. No one's ever designated me as such, but uh, the first place I go when you talk about that, or where I'm experiencing church outside of church, is there. I have counseled grandmothers. 2 weeks ago, grandmother whose 20-year-old grandson inexplicably died, and whose 12-year-old sister tried to do CPR on him to bring him back to life in the family home. And I'm in a hot tub in my bathing suit. And another woman who knows that I'm a community theologian says, "You should talk to John." And we get introduced and we talk, and we've talked 4 or 5 times since. And I might be going out with her husband for a beer because he can't talk. So pastorally, that story has played out, a story like that, dozens of times in the pool. Last January, during the pandemic, we were pretty COVID aware when I was still pastoring a church, and took on a policy that if you're going to come back to church as the pandemic was waning, you had to have your shots. And we got royally dumped upon by the right wing, and a lot of church, right wing, sort of theologian types. And the mayor heard me being interviewed on CBC Radio on the morning show, kind of sharing the story of what happened. And in that interview, I really wanted to not hit back hard or any. I just wanted to be a loving person and gracious in terms of trying to understand why people dumped on us as much as they did. And anyway, had a great conversation. The mayor heard it and called me 2 days later and just said, "Hey, we've got your back." Really appreciated that. And then this past January, a year ago, agreed to an interview with me. And so I interviewed her about the theology of civic leadership, and ended up having a pretty cool conversation around politics and faith, but an even cooler conversation around Sikhism, which I knew nothing about, but she comes from a Sikh tradition. And if you look at this top 8 things that define what Sikhism is, I mean, you could have put an example of it in Jesus's life, and then a teaching from Jesus, and then a parable from Jesus on each of those 8 points. And caring for widows and orphans, the whole thing was all there. And I'm going, oh, so we had this very cool public conversation in the library downtown with a group of 50 people there, and that was as much church as anything I've ever done in church. Writing for me as a writer, writing for the Herald, like, how does that happen? And how do they keep saying yes to these ideas and are open, for the faith and reason section in the paper, which is where I've been doing a lot of my stuff lately. But recently, this year, stuff for the actual opinion page, right? About housing and scooching over a little bit everybody so that everyone can have a house or a home to live in this city. And then another one on the water crisis about humility. And so those are some places where it can practically play out. Seeing all community as God's community, seeing all experiences of glory, wherever you have them, in a church, singing a hymn, hearing a sermon, or in Kananaskis on a Sunday morning.
Or when the waters stir in the pool, right? And pool of Bethesda, I'm thinking of, and the pools of the hot tub. So
yeah, all there.
Yeah. So for some of my family's sake, I do have to ask you to touch base a little bit with what happens when Metallica enters the church. I kept trying to think of a good little tagline or lead in of how when Metallica entered, even the Sandman woke up. But please do give us a little taste on this.
What happened with that?
Yeah.
It's hard not to make it a long story, but basically, a kid from church, after I preached on U2, came up and asked if, in my weak moment post preaching, if I'd do a sermon on his favorite band, and I said yes before he told me it was Metallica. and I was trying to figure out. I told him I'd pray about it, which is the way pastors slough off their parishioners. Only 2 days later, a newbie to the church gave me and my wife free tickets to the Metallica concert the next month, and right on the stage, a rotating stage on the Saddle Dome. And so I thought, okay, maybe I better think about this. And so we go, and I start to listen to the music, and I wasn't into Metallica at all. But soon started to see all kinds of echoes in their music. I mean, they actually quote the Old Testament and speak about the wrath of God during the 10 plagues and the Exodus. And they rail against a lot of the same stuff Jesus railed against in terms of the consumerism of our society and the hypocrisy, and it was all there. And then when I found out that James Hetfield, the lead singer, had gone through a journey of realizing he couldn't rage away his anger or drink away or drug away his anger, he had to forgive away his anger. Then I go, okay, this will preach. And so I preached it, and Metallica sent a Warner Music camera crew to the church to film it because the drummer, Lars Ulrich, wanted to hear this sermon preached on the band. So that Metallica came to church sort of with this, but yeah, it was cool, but it was the same, thing that I brought up throughout our conversation here. God is more at work in the world and in all of every person's life in ways that maybe we can't imagine, the church can't imagine. So what kind of new imagination would a re-enchanted world need to have to begin to name and see and recognize the good things that God's given us everywhere, through everyone? So yeah, even heavy metal, it was a cool story.
I have some family members that are probably going to be pretty pumped about listening to this. This is awesome. I hope it's okay. I loop myself into this with you as a fellow community theologian. I commend you on the bravery of going to a Metallica concert.
Yeah.
And as well as being willing to share about the amazing ways Jesus enters our community and builds a church without walls. So, yeah. And I want to thank you, John, especially for joining me today in conversation to talk about, work life, vocation, and calling. and the life of disability. And meaningful ways we are seen by God in all work. So thank you, John, for being with me today.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation, Eric. You're an easy guy to talk to. Just the kind of real gentle, thoughtful, engaging, inviting. So that was a gift. Thanks for all of that.